Good evening and welcome back to Mr. Night Dread. Whether you've been here before or this is your first night with us, you've entered the channel that delivers only the most disturbing true horror stories. Tonight we're sinking into 8 most disturbing true cruise ship horror stories. And understand this clearly. These stories aren't made up. They are most disturbing true horror stories that unfolded in the US, drawn from real American passengers and crew who thought a cruise would be a dream, until it became something far darker. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share, because every story I tell isn't just for chills, it's a reminder. Ignoring these lessons has left others with lasting fear they never expected. So don't wait. Hit that subscribe button before the video continues. In this channel, hesitation only means missing the warnings hidden in these true accounts. I want to tell you about something that happened to a friend of mine, Jason Harper, on a cruise out of Galveston, Texas last summer. Jason isn't the type to exaggerate. He's level-headed, practical, a software engineer from Houston. But the week he spent aboard the Oceanic Horizon left him shaken in a way I've rarely seen. It started on the second night. Jason was staying in a midship interior cabin on deck 6 near the aft elevators. The ship was swaying gently that evening, nothing unusual, just a mild Gulf breeze. He'd been listening to music from the onboard piano bar nearby when around 11:45 p.m. he heard frantic pounding at his cabin door. A man's voice screamed through the door, "Don't open it! Don't open it!" Jason froze. He was alone in the cabin. The hallway beyond the door seemed impossibly narrow, compressed by the ship's movement and the muffled bar music. He could hear the man pounding again, loud, insistent, desperate. Jason grabbed his phone, ready to call security, but when he opened the door, nothing. No one was there. Not a shadow, not a figure disappearing down the corridor. Only the faint sway of the ship, the echo of the piano bar, and the silence of an empty hallway. The next night, it happened again. Jason swore he could hear the same voice, the same frantic pounding, the same desperate screams of warning. "Don't open it!" By the third night, he was terrified. He told the cruise staff, who assured him it must be a prank, maybe another passenger moving erratically. They checked the hallway cameras. Nothing. No one had walked by. No one had entered or exited the corridor. The footage showed the hallway completely empty during the times Jason swore he heard the knocks. But Jason insisted it was real. He described the man's appearance. Mid-40s, wearing a dark polo shirt, slightly disheveled hair, eyes wide with fear. Jason said he could even see the sweat glinting on the man's forehead in the dim hallway lights. The fourth night was worse. Jason had almost convinced himself to lock the cabin door, sit on the bed, and wait it out. Around midnight, he heard the pounding again. Louder this time. He felt the floor tremble slightly with each strike. And then, he caught a glimpse of the man through the small peephole in his door. Jason froze. His breath caught. The face staring back at him was his own. It took him a moment to realize what he was seeing. He stumbled back, pressed himself against the opposite wall, convinced it was some trick of the hallway lights, some reflection in the polished metal door handles. But no. The figure outside the cabin, his own face, was pounding, screaming, "Don't open it!" He stepped back, eyes wide, unsure whether to call for help or flee. And just like that, it vanished. The hallway was empty again, the camera footage later confirming no one had ever passed by. No one had ever stood there. Jason didn't sleep the rest of the cruise. He avoided his cabin entirely, sleeping on couches in the public lounge, in the aft observation area, wherever he could escape the corridor he once called home. When he finally returned home to Houston, he told me the most unsettling part wasn't the pounding or the screams. It was the memory of seeing his own face out there. He doesn't remember leaving his cabin that night. He doesn't remember anyone standing there. And yet, there it was, staring back at him. Jason keeps telling himself it was exhaustion, the swaying ship, a hallucination born of isolation. But he hasn't been able to explain the pounding, the voice, or the face that looked just like his. And even now, months later, when he closes his eyes, he swears he can hear it. The frantic knocks, the terrified scream, "Don't open it!" But he doesn't remember doing it. I remember the moment like it was yesterday. I had stepped onto the upper deck of the Carolina Dream somewhere off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. The night was unnaturally quiet, no laughter, no distant clinking of glasses from the lower decks. Just the cold, damp air and the rhythmic slap of water against the hull. I was alone, or so I thought. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper carried by the wind. "Don't look overboard." I froze. My heart started hammering, not just because of the sudden warning, but because of the impossibility of it. There was no one around. The upper deck stretched for what felt like miles, and the darkness beyond the rail was complete. The horizon was black, blending seamlessly with the ocean, making it impossible to know where the ship ended and the water began. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe someone playing a prank. But then I noticed something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, following me as I moved along the deck. Only they weren't quite footsteps. They were too heavy, almost dragging, like someone had boots wet from seawater. I turned sharply, expecting to see a crew member or a fellow passenger, but the deck was empty. The air grew heavier. I could hear something else now, breath. Shallow and close, but impossible to locate. My own breathing became louder in my ears. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost a caress against my ear. "Don't look overboard." I took a step back from the railing. I wanted to believe it was just imagination, nerves playing tricks after a long day of sightseeing and sun. But then I realized other passengers later swore they hadn't seen anyone else up there. Not a single soul. I spent the rest of that night pacing the deck, unable to sleep in my cabin. Every now and then I would hear it, the footsteps starting again, and that whisper always urging me not to look. I didn't understand why, and I didn't want to. There was a part of me, a deep, instinctual part, that felt as though looking overboard would change everything, that it would reveal something I wasn't meant to see. The next morning I tried to tell someone, a crew member, anyone, but the look on their face told me everything. Confusion, concern, and finally, disbelief. "There was no one on the upper deck last night," they said. "You were alone." I pressed the issue, describing the footsteps, the whisper, even the feeling of breath on my neck. They nodded politely but didn't respond, as if humoring a passenger who had simply imagined a nightmare. I asked if there were any other reports, anyone who had experienced something similar. They shook their heads. The log showed no other passengers in that section at the time. Not a single person. I couldn't shake the memory. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it again. The wind brushing my ear, soft but insistent. "Don't look overboard." Months later, I found myself back in Charleston, walking along the old harbor. The ocean stretched out before me, calm, endless. I couldn't bring myself to board another cruise, but I was drawn to the water. My friends teased me, said I was being dramatic, but I knew the truth. There was something out there, just beyond the visible horizon. Something that had wanted my attention, or maybe my silence. I sometimes think about what would have happened if I had ignored the warning, if I had leaned over the railing. Part of me doesn't want to know. Part of me fears I already did. So if you ever hear it, if you ever feel a whisper in the dark on an empty deck, footsteps following your own, a presence you cannot see. Listen. Listen and don't turn, because looking overboard might be the one choice that changes everything. Forever. I woke up on a pool chair. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, spilling pale light across the water. My skin was damp, my towel tangled around my legs, and the faint smell of chlorine still clung to my hair. For a moment, I couldn't remember how I got there. I glanced around, empty deck chairs, lifeless umbrellas swaying gently in the breeze, the low murmur of the early crew moving about. It was quiet, almost too quiet for a cruise ship that had been alive with laughter and music only hours before. I called out to someone, anyone, but my voice felt foreign in the open space swallowed by the vastness of the deck. The pool's surface reflected the rising sun, and I noticed something strange, a pair of sunglasses, identical to mine, lying neatly on the edge of the chair beside me. I didn't remember setting them there. I wandered toward the dining area, hoping to find someone who could explain how I ended up outside. The cafeteria smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bagels, the same way it always did at sunrise. A crew member wiped tables, glancing at me with polite indifference. I tried to ask about the evening before, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't explain why I felt so disoriented. As I walked down the promenade deck, I noticed other guests moving as if nothing unusual had happened. Families were setting up chairs by the pool, couples sipped morning mimosas, and a child's laughter cut sharply through the air. But something about their movements felt off, repeated almost like a recording. A man waved at me from a table, and when I blinked, he was doing the same exact gesture again, as if caught in a loop. The next thing I remember, I was back on my pool chair. Sunrise again, wet towel, chlorine, the same crew murmuring their morning routines. I looked around, confused and growing uneasy. Was this the same day repeating itself? My sunglasses were once again on the chair next to me, perfectly aligned. I pinched myself, stood up, and tried to retrace my steps. Every corridor, every lounge, every deck seemed to fold back on itself. I visited the casino, hoping the buzzing slot machines and the faint scent of spilled drinks might ground me. The air was thick with a mixture of sugar and metal, but even here something was off. A woman dropped her purse, and when I bent to help, she looked straight through me, her face blank, then repeated the same motion moments later, as if the world around me had frozen and restarted. Days, or what felt like days, blurred together. I kept ending up on that same pool chair at sunrise, wet towel, chlorine, the same quiet murmurs from the crew. I started keeping a journal in the small notebook I always carried, jotting down every detail I could remember. I would see the same conversations repeating, the same drinks being served, the same crew members moving along the same paths. I tried to leave the deck, walk toward the gangway, the ship's exit, but the corridors twisted strangely. Hallways I thought I knew led me back to the same pool deck. I spoke to guests, but none of them seemed aware of anything unusual. When I asked questions, they smiled politely, then walked away, leaving me with the growing sense that I was trapped in a day that refused to end. One night, or perhaps morning, I wasn't sure anymore, I sat by the railing looking down at the city lights of Miami. The port should have been welcoming passengers, luggage being unloaded, the sounds of traffic drifting across the water. But the harbor was empty. No cars, no cranes, nothing moving beyond the gentle sway of the waves against the hull. I realized then that the ship hadn't docked. I don't know if it ever would. The guests, the crew, even the routines, they were all stuck in this unchanging rhythm, and I was stuck along with them. Every sunrise brought the same small details, repeated with near perfection. My heart pounded when I thought, have I already lived this day before? I started watching others closely. Were they aware? Were they trapped too, or had they already accepted it? I've kept a mental note of every anomaly. The second pair of sunglasses, the repeated gestures, the crew who never responded to my questions. And I wonder even now if I am the only one trying to break free or if every voyage ends the same way. If you've ever been on a cruise, think about this. What if the moment you step aboard, the day you experience isn't truly your own? What if every morning you wake, the sun rises again and the same hours are waiting, repeating just beneath the surface of the cheerful decks? I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it happened on what was supposed to be the most relaxing week of my life. I was on a cruise out of Miami, heading down toward the Florida Keys. The kind of cruise that promises turquoise waters, endless buffets, and live music in the evenings. I had booked a standard interior cabin on Deck 5, somewhere near the aft, close to the engine room. The room itself was small, barely enough space for 2 people and our luggage, but clean, with the faint smell of disinfectant that clung to cruise cabins everywhere. The first couple of nights were unremarkable. You hear the engines hum constantly. It becomes part of the background, a low vibration under your feet and through the walls. Most passengers barely notice it. I would fall asleep listening to the ship's gentle sway. But then, on the third night around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise I couldn't explain. It started as a faint metallic thud. At first I thought maybe it was a crew member closing a service door or a dropped tray from the galley above, but then I heard it again, this time paired with a scratching, almost like nails being dragged along wood. It came from the wall beside my bed. I froze. My cabin mate, Mark, was snoring lightly, unaware. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just the ship settling, the pipes, the ventilation system. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. And then I heard whispers. Not clearly, just fragments. Something like, "Help, get out." Or maybe I imagined it. My heart was pounding, and I swear the whispers came from the vents themselves, weaving through the thin cabin walls. I tried to reason it out. "It's just the walls," I whispered to myself. "Cabins are close together. Someone else is moving around next door." But when I asked Mark if he heard anything, he just mumbled and rolled over. The next morning, I mentioned it to a crew member while waiting for coffee at the aft cafe. I figured they'd laugh it off or say it was normal. But the look on the young woman's face froze me. She paused, glanced toward the hall, and said quietly, "Those adjoining cabins? Nobody's booked in there? They've been empty since we left Miami." I blinked, thinking I misheard. "Empty?" I asked, my voice catching. She nodded. "Completely. The rooms next to yours weren't on the manifest. No passengers, no crew assignments, nothing." I remember walking down the hall later, staring at those cabin doors. They looked normal. The nameplates were blank, the locks unbroken. Nothing to suggest anyone had ever been there, but every so often a faint thump or scratch would echo from somewhere behind those walls. I tried to push it out of my mind, tried to chalk it up to imagination, but sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it again. A light tap, a scratching, almost like someone pacing or clawing at the wall from inside. By the fourth night, I started recording. I set my phone to capture the sound at full volume, hoping to catch the culprit, or at least convince myself it was normal. And that night, it happened again. The scratching, the faint thud, almost rhythmic, almost purposeful. I listened as it moved along the wall, pausing near the vent and then fading back toward the end of the corridor. The whispers came again. Not words this time, just a soft exhale like someone breathing against the wall right beside my ear. I ran to the reception desk in the middle of the night, shaking. I told them everything. They called maintenance, checked the floor plan, the cameras, the booking records. Nothing. Every single adjoining cabin had remained unoccupied since departure. Security footage showed only empty hallways. No one had entered. No one had left. By the end of the cruise, I was a wreck. I slept in the main lounge some nights, trying to escape my own cabin, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the engine noise or stress. But I never felt safe again in that small, confined space. Even now, I think about those rooms, about the metallic thuds, the slow scratches along the wall, and those faint, impossible whispers. Who or what was there? I asked the crew one last time before disembarking. "Seriously," I said, voice low. "Those rooms, someone must have been in there, right?" They just shook their heads. They were empty. Always have been. And that's where it ended. Except it didn't. Because sometimes when I'm lying in bed back at home in Tampa, I swear I can still hear it. The faint scratch, a single tap, like someone pacing just behind the walls. So who was scratching from the inside? I remember walking into the buffet that morning like it was any other day. The Atlantic stretched beyond the railing of the mariner's horizon, and the air smelled faintly of salt and coffee. The dining hall was bright, polished, and humming with the usual sounds. The clinking of silverware, the quiet laughter of families, and the low murmur of conversation as crew members moved with practiced ease. I joined the line, tray in hand, thinking about what I'd like for breakfast. Pancakes, maybe some scrambled eggs, a slice of melon. The usual cruise morning routine. But something felt off. No, it wasn't immediately noticeable, it was subtle. Like déjà vu before you know it. I stepped forward to grab a plate, and the person in front of me moved exactly the same way I had the day before. Or was it just moments ago? A man in a blue polo reached for the toast at the same moment I reached for the butter. A child dropped a fork, bent down to pick it up, and I caught my own reflection in the window. It was like I'd already seen this exact sequence, though I couldn't place when. I shrugged it off. Cruises are predictable, I told myself. Repetition is part of the comfort, but then I noticed the Wi-Fi. My phone blinked, searching for signal. The app that tracks dining schedules froze. For a moment, the usual notifications were gone, replaced by a single, brief, cryptic message. "Get out." I laughed nervously. It had to be a glitch. I showed it to a nearby couple, but their screens displayed the usual breakfast options: pancakes, eggs, bacon. They looked at me like I'd said something odd, smiled politely, and continued their routine. I moved along the line, observing the guests. And that's when I began to notice a rhythm. A strange, almost choreographed repetition. People moved as though following cues I couldn't hear. Forks in perfect synchronization, chairs scraping in the exact same moment, conversations overlapping in identical cadence. Even the servers, cheerful as they were, seemed to move in a pattern I couldn't track, yet I couldn't ignore. I tried changing my own movements, stepping aside to let someone else pass, but it didn't matter. The buffet line didn't end. Each time I thought I had reached the last station, coffee, pastries, juice, it looped back to the beginning. I started counting the same plates I'd already taken, the same chafing dishes I'd already filled. It was endless. Panic began to creep in. I left my tray and walked toward the hall exit. Passengers glanced at me, their expressions blank yet oddly knowing, as if I had missed a cue, as if I were late to an unseen performance. By the time I returned to my cabin, I expected to find relief, solitude, a bed, something familiar. Instead, the door swung open to reveal nothing. The room was bare. No suitcase, no bed, no personal items. Even the keycard slot blinked as if I'd never booked the room at all. I pressed my hand against the smooth wall, searching for a seam, a door, anything that could explain it. There was nothing. I went back to the dining hall, hoping it was just a misunderstanding. But the buffet continued without pause. Guests moved in perfect rhythm, smiles fixed. The chafing dishes shimmered with untouched food, trays lined up like clockwork. Every step I had taken was mirrored by someone else, every glance answered by a pair of eyes that had no owner. I left the hall and wandered the ship's corridors, trying to locate staff, any crew member who could tell me what was happening. Phones, the app, even the passenger manifest, nothing registered me. It was as if I had never been there at all, as if I were a ghost walking among the living. I finally sat on a bench near the railing, staring at the waves. The sun glinted off the ocean in the east, painting a serene picture that sharply contradicted the chaos in my mind. And then it hit me. Maybe the buffet never ended because my presence there had never been meant to be acknowledged. Maybe in some way I had never truly boarded the mariner's horizon at all. That thought made my skin crawl, not because of what I saw, but because of what I couldn't explain. I don't know how long I stayed there, watching the horizon, trying to convince myself I could wake up. Every time I walked past the dining hall, the lines stretched endlessly, the same faces repeating the same motions. Maybe the buffet was a trap. Maybe I had slipped between schedules, between the manifest, between the real and the imagined. If you ever hear a cruise buffet described as endless, if someone jokes about losing track of the line, think about it differently. Because in the right or wrong circumstances, maybe you weren't ever really a guest at all. And if that buffet opens for you tomorrow, maybe you shouldn't join the line. I'll never forget what I saw on the observation deck that night. The Ocean Empress was cutting through the calm Atlantic just off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. The air was heavy with salt, the scent sharp and clean, and the faint glow of the moon skimming across the water made the horizon seem endless. Everything looked serene. Too serene. I had stepped out for some air after dinner. The dining hall had been crowded, laughter bouncing off the polished railings and the high glass windows. I needed quiet. The deck was nearly empty. Just the soft whir of the ship's engines, the creak of the railings beneath my fingers, and the occasional distant shout of a crew member making their rounds. And then I noticed it, my reflection in the glass, perfectly clear, but something was off. I lifted my hand and it followed, but just a fraction of a second too late. My reflection blinked a beat behind me. I frowned and shook my head, telling myself I was tired, imagining things. But the more I moved, the more the lag became noticeable. At first it was subtle. I turned my head to look at the horizon. The reflection looked elsewhere for a heartbeat before catching up. I shifted my stance, stepped back from the railing, and it mirrored me slowly, almost hesitating. My pulse quickened. I felt the familiar, reassuring warmth of the ship beneath my feet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching, just beyond recognition. I called out, "Hello? Anyone up here?" No one answered. The deck was silent, save for the whisper of the wind. Then I saw the shadow. Not mine, at least not exactly. It lingered on the deck just behind my reflection, dark against the moonlit planks. I turned sharply. Nothing. Just the gentle sway of the ship and the distant lights of Charleston fading behind us. I took a cautious step forward. The shadow moved too, following at the same hesitant pace as my reflection, yet never aligning perfectly. It was always just a little behind, a little skewed, like reality itself was bending, or maybe refusing to match. I leaned against the railing, staring down at the water, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. The reflection on the glass rippled faintly, a trick of the moonlight, maybe. But then it blinked again, and I realized with a chill that the reflection's blink didn't match mine. I raised my hand to rub my eyes. The reflection raised its own, but later, slower, almost deliberately. I wasn't the only one who noticed. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw a crew member, a young woman named Emily, walking toward me. She smiled, genuinely concerned. "Are you okay, sir?" I explained, my voice tight, almost trembling. I described the lag, the shadow. She nodded sympathetically, reaching out as if to guide me away. But then I caught my reflection in the glass again, and her reflection didn't move. Not at all. She blinked, smiled, and yet her mirrored counterpart remained frozen, staring blankly back at me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to tell her to reach for her hand, but it was like touching the water itself, empty, unreal. I stepped back, the boards creaking under my weight, and the shadow on the deck seemed to flicker, stretching toward me and then retreating. I ran down the stairwell, seeking any sense of safety in the lower decks. Crew members passed me, attentive, helpful, reassuring, but every reflection I passed stayed still. They smiled at me, guided me gently, but the mirror in the hallway, the stainless steel doors, the tiny porthole windows, all of them betrayed the truth. Nothing moved but me. I spent the rest of the night pacing the deck, staring at my own reflection, trying to catch the shadow, trying to wake up from what I thought had to be a dream. But morning came, pale and gray over the horizon near Norfolk, Virginia, and the sun illuminated the ship like any normal day. The crew acted as if nothing had happened. The passengers laughed, chatted, and queued for breakfast. I left the observation deck for the last time that morning. The scent of salt lingered in my nostrils, sharp and sweet, but the air was otherwise empty. Quiet in a way that made me feel I had been entirely alone, yet still observed. Even now, months later, I can close my eyes and see that glass, that lagging reflection, that shadow that never quite aligned. I can smell the salt in the air, feel the planks beneath my feet, and yet nothing else. Something on that deck stayed behind, tethered to the ship, waiting. And I still wonder, did I ever really leave the observation deck at all? I still smell the salt in the air, but nothing else. I was sitting at a corner table in the dining room of the Atlantic Voyager, somewhere off the coast of Miami, Florida. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow across the polished tables. The air smelled faintly of roasted garlic and butter, mingling with the soft scent of seawater seeping in through the open deck doors. Servers moved in near-perfect synchronization, carrying silver platters with mechanical precision, smiling at every table with the same practiced cheer. I had just taken a sip of water when a voice, soft, almost intimate, leaned into my ear. "This isn't your cruise." Levi froze. The man was older, wearing a navy blazer that looked tailored, a gold pin glinting on his lapel. His eyes were calm but insistent, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten. I blinked, and when I looked back, he was gone. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe I was imagining it. Late dinner, long day at the port in Key West, a little too much sun and salt. But then I noticed it. Every conversation around me sounded familiar. At the table ahead, a family laughed at a joke I was certain I'd heard before, word for word from a different table. The man to my left recited the same story, the same punchline. Even the waiters repeated phrases, glancing at me just a beat too late, like echoes of themselves. I felt the hair on my arm stand on end, but no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. They were caught in a rhythm I couldn't break. I left my table and walked toward the hallway leading to the cabins. The bright carpets and polished brass railings were comforting, familiar. But every turn I took brought me back to the same corner of the dining room where I had started. I tried counting doors, memorizing patterns, anything to orient myself, but it was useless. Each hallway looped like a Mobius strip, bringing me back to the same scene. The chandeliers glinting, servers moving in perfect sync, passengers laughing at jokes I had already heard. Panic started to rise. I pressed myself against the wall and waited, listening. The muffled footsteps of other guests passed me. I peeked around a corner. The dining room was still there. The man who had whispered at me was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of plates and polite conversation. I ran to my cabin, desperate for something real, something I could claim as mine. My keycard worked. I slid the door open, expecting the familiar interior. The suitcase I had unpacked, my clothes, my toiletries. But the room was identical to mine in every detail, except for one thing. On the bed, neatly folded, was a second set of my belongings. Another me had been here. Another version of myself, apparently returning from the same dining hall, tracing the same loops, living the same night. I staggered back, almost tripping over the edge of the bed. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave. I didn't know where leaving would even take me. But I knew one thing. I wasn't the first version of me to sit at that corner table. I wasn't the only one to hear that warning whispered in the dim glow of the chandeliers. I spent hours wandering the decks, staring at the same tables, the same corridors, the same reflections of people I thought I recognized. Everything was repeated, rehearsed, yet subtly altered in ways I couldn't comprehend. I spoke to crew members. They nodded, smiled politely, and carried on as if nothing had happened. But when I looked at their reflections in the windows or the polished brass handrails, they didn't move. They were frozen, staring back with empty eyes. I finally found myself on the upper deck near the railing, staring out at the moonlit Atlantic. The water glimmered in quiet waves, calm and endless. I pressed my hand against the cool steel and tried to ground myself, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about the second me, sitting on the bed in my cabin, watching, waiting, possibly wondering the same thing I was. That's when it hit me. Maybe the warning wasn't meant for anyone else. Maybe it had been for me, the first me, or maybe for the second. Maybe I wasn't the one who would return home. If you ever hear a warning on a cruise, if a stranger leans close and tells you to leave, listen, because you may not be the only one there at all. Housekeeping said they found the cabin empty. I remember because it was directly across from mine. They reported the bed still warm, luggage neatly packed, but the guest, gone, vanished. No note, no explanation, just nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cruise ships are busy. People leave early, sometimes in the middle of the night. Maybe it was a late checkout or a medical emergency. But the next morning, whispers started. Crew members in the hallway, voices barely audible. Room 418, empty again. I don't understand. She was just here. Another one, gone. I tried to ignore it, but the unease grew. I peeked at the housekeeping logs tucked behind the desk in the main corridor near the elevators. Cabin after cabin had been marked vacant despite passengers being seen enjoying dinner or lounging on the upper deck just hours before. By the time I reached my own cabin that evening, I was already on edge. The corridors felt longer, quieter, though passengers walked past, smiling, chatting, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the tension. I passed rooms where laughter had sounded earlier, only to find them empty when I peeked through the crack in the door. Clothes neatly folded on beds, toiletries untouched, yet no one inside. I spoke to a crew member named Daniel, a young man from Jacksonville, Florida, who had been on the ship for several years. He looked uncomfortable. "Sometimes people just disappear," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not all of them. Just a few. And sometimes we find the rooms empty as if the guest never existed." I laughed nervously, though my heart raced. I asked him to clarify. He shook his head and gestured toward the cabin decks. "You've seen the reports," he said. Manifest doesn't match reality. Guests vanish, belongings stay. You can check for yourself. That's exactly what I did. I traced the deck where the missing guests had been reported. I passed the cabins late at night, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The hall lights glowed softly, casting shadows that stretched along the patterned carpet. And then I heard it, a lock clicking, a faint, deliberate click coming from one of the vacant cabins. My stomach dropped. I pressed my ear against the door, heart hammering. Silence. Then faintly, the scrape of luggage being moved inside. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging. The hallway was empty. No passengers, no crew, nothing. Yet the sound had come from the cabin across from mine, the very one housekeeping had marked vacant hours ago. I couldn't explain it. I asked to see the manifest myself. Cabin 418, my cabin. My name was not on the list. None of my information had been recorded. I checked again. The details of my booking, my tickets, my personal information, all present in my email confirmations, my credit card statements, but nowhere in the ship's official manifest. It was as if, officially, I had never boarded. I went to the elevators, hands shaking, trying to steady my breath. The ship was quiet, calm. Families were sleeping, crew were patrolling. Yet in the corridors, I felt the absence of something, or someone. And then it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. Something about the ship itself, the way the cabins looped, the way rooms emptied while passengers were elsewhere. It wasn't random. It was structured, observed, waiting. I walked slowly past cabin 418 one more time, the polished brass lock catching the dim corridor light. And there it was again, a soft click. The door swung open a fraction, revealing the interior. Bed neatly made, luggage still packed, as if it had always been ready for a guest. You pass that cabin tonight, and hear the lock click open. I don't know who or what opens it. I don't know why. I only know that if you step inside, even for a moment, you might find yourself somewhere between reality and the echo of passengers who were never meant to exist. And for all I know, I might have been one of them. The ship sailed on, past the Florida Keys, through calm waters, passengers enjoying the sun on deck as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those cabins, in the rows of empty rooms, the ship was quietly waiting for the next guest who wasn't supposed to be there at all. And you might be that guest.